They packed for victory, not for war. Silk banners embroidered with saints. Velvet cloaks for the triumph through London. Gold goblets for the banquet they would hold in Westminster Hall after the heretic queen was dethroned. Some even brought musicians for the procession and priests for the mass conversions that would follow. The Duke of Medina Sidonia carried a map of England already divided among Spain's nobility. Estates awarded, lands parcelled, glory pre-written. But 6 months later, those same nobles would wash up on Irish beaches, pale and bloated, their rings cut from swollen fingers, their silks torn to rags by the waves. Farmers stripped their corpses for anything of use. Cloaks became blankets, gold chains paid for potatoes, and where Spain had planned a crusade, the Atlantic delivered a burial. This is the story of how the Invincible Armada, La Armada Invincible, became Europe's most magnificent disaster. How the richest empire on earth lost to an island half its size. How faith became delusion, and how more men died of hunger, madness, and salt water than of English guns. For Philip II, King of Spain, this was no campaign. It was God's will. He called it La Empresa de Inglaterra, the enterprise of England, a holy mission to destroy Protestant heresy forever. The Pope blessed the fleet and promised 1,000,000 gold ducats for success. Every sailor received indulgence. If he died in battle, his soul would skip purgatory entirely. Priests held mass on every deck, swinging censers beside loaded cannon, while banners blessed at Santiago de Compostela snapped in the wind. This was not an invasion. It was a crusade, and the crusade glittered like a dream. 130 ships, galleons, galleasses, merchantmen, and hulking supply hulks, carrying 30,000 men, 19,000 soldiers, 8,000 sailors, 2,000 chained galley slaves, and more than 1,000 priests, surgeons, and bureaucrats ready to govern England in God's name. The holds were stuffed with everything a divine empire needed to conquer a nation. 40,000 gallons of olive oil, 14,000 barrels of wine, 600,000 pounds of salted pork, and 5,000 rosaries for English souls soon to be redeemed. But heaven's army was already rotting. Behind the painted saints and polished cannon lay the truth: corruption. Contractors had grown rich selling poison in barrels. The salted pork was horse and dog meat dyed pink to look fresh. The water was green and crawling with insects before the fleet even left port. The cheese oozed grey slime. The biscuits were alive with maggots. Walking bread, the sailors called it. When they ate, they blew the larvae from their cups before drinking. One chronicler would later say, "We did not need the English. Our own food was killing us, and yet Spain sailed, proud, prayerful, and doomed." At the helm stood Don Alonso Perez de Guzman, the 7th Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman chosen not for skill but for pedigree. He had never commanded a ship, never fought a battle, and suffered from crippling seasickness. He begged the king to pick another. Philip refused. "God will guide you," he said. So, the mightiest fleet in human history set forth under a man who could barely stand on deck without vomiting. The battle plan was as holy as it was hopeless. Sail up the English Channel in a great crescent, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's 30,000 troops in the Spanish Netherlands, and ferry them across to Kent for the march on London. But Parma had no ships. The Dutch rebels held the coasts. The rendezvous point was shallow, the tide unpredictable, and English spies already knew every detail. Philip had built a war that required his enemies to cooperate. Still, the Armada sailed from Lisbon on May 30th, 1588. A procession of glory wrapped in disaster. The first storm broke the fleet's formation and the illusion of divine order. Men prayed louder than the thunder, clutching rosaries slick with seawater as the decks rolled under them. Priests shouted hymns over the wind, while officers bellowed orders no one could hear. When daylight came, 4 ships were gone. Others limped into Coruña, leaking and splintered, their crews half dead from exhaustion. The Duke wrote to Philip, "The fleet is unfit to proceed." The king replied with a single line, "Proceed." God, after all, did not delay for weather. As carpenters patched holes with wet planks, the stench grew unbearable. The meat in the barrels was liquefying. The biscuits squirmed with worms, even water turned against them. Sailors drank green slime and vomited it back onto the decks. Flies clung to every surface, and the smell followed the fleet like a curse. Men began to sicken, scurvy, fever, dysentery, and the cramped holds became floating tombs. When a man died, his messmates dragged him up and dropped him into the sea. muttering prayers that sounded more like relief than mourning. The Duke of Medina Sidonia tried to lead by dignity alone. He dressed in silk robes, refused to sit while sick, and wrote daily letters of devotion to his king. But he was no seaman. Every gust of wind seemed to bewilder him. Officers whispered that their commander ruled from his knees, always praying, always nauseated. One chronicler claimed he could be found on deck gripping the railing with one hand and a crucifix with the other, unable to tell which direction the fleet was even facing. Meanwhile, the English knew everything. Philip's obsession with secrecy had achieved the opposite. His entire plan had leaked. Walsingham's spies had infiltrated ports, parishes, even the Spanish court. Anthony Standen, disguised as a translator, sent reports from the flagship itself, tiny notes written on silk, sewn into wine casks. The English watched the Armada's every move before it even left Iberia. When the black sails were sighted off Cornwall, beacons blazed across the coast. In less than 12 hours, every English captain knew the fleet was coming. The English navy was smaller, faster, and lighter. Their ships could outturn anything Spain had built. But more than that, they had men who knew the channel like the veins on their hands. Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham waited at Plymouth, their crews restless and hungry. When the wind turned in their favour, they didn't chase glory. They harassed, darted, and withdrew, striking from distance. To them, this wasn't divine war. It was calculation, seamanship, and cold advantage. England's faith lay in gunpowder, not God. The first skirmishes near Plymouth were inconclusive, but they revealed everything. Spanish cannon were built for sieges, not ship duels, firing stone balls that shattered walls but bounced off moving hulls. English guns, smaller and faster, fired iron shot that tore planks and men alike. When English broadsides struck, the Spanish couldn't even respond quickly. Their gun decks were too high, their crews too slow, their ammunition too heavy. Each exchange chipped away at the illusion of invincibility, and yet the Spanish still sang hymns after every volley. Certain divine intervention was near. The longer they sailed, the more their supplies decayed. Meat turned black, water undrinkable, bread crawling with larvae. Sailors boiled leather belts for food. Priests told them that suffering proved holiness, but even the most devout began to doubt. Rats became a delicacy. A loaf of dry biscuit was worth a week's pay. Some sailors chewed candle wax just to quiet their stomachs. The sea that was supposed to deliver them to glory now starved them one day at a time. The weather refused mercy. Cold rains soaked gunpowder, and the wind changed faster than orders could be shouted. The Armada was built for calm seas and steady formation. The channel offered neither. Ships collided in fog, masts splintered, anchors snapped. Captains bickered over signals they couldn't see, their formations twisting into chaos. By the time they reached the narrowest part of the channel, the Invincible Crescent was a ragged, gasping thing, a procession of crippled hulls, sickness, and faith held together by superstition. Still, the Duke pressed forward. The plan demanded that he meet Parma's army in Flanders and escort them across the North Sea. But the Dutch rebels controlled the estuaries, blocking the transports. Parma's troops were stranded, watching helplessly from shore as the Armada circled out of range. Every hour they waited, English ships struck again, cutting, burning, retreating. The Duke sent frantic messages for help, but the currents carried them nowhere. The fleet was trapped between two enemies, the English to the south and the sea itself to the north. At dawn one grey morning, lookouts saw lights approaching. They thought it was Parma's reinforcements. It wasn't. The English had sent fire ships, old vessels packed with tar, pitch, and gunpowder, set ablaze and drifting with the tide. The sight turned men's courage to panic. Anchors were cut, formations broken, and ships collided in darkness as the inferno swept through the channel. The sea became a torch, and the prayers turned to screams. By dawn, the Armada was scattered, the Duke disoriented, and the English waiting. The Invincible fleet had survived the fire, but it would never recover its order, its faith, or its hope. The dawn after the fireships was a graveyard of drifting masts. Smoke clung to the sea like fog. The Duke, sleepless and trembling, tried to reform the fleet, but half his captains were lost or dead. Anchors had been cut, signals misread, and ships drifted miles apart. The air reeked of burnt tar and wet ash. Men stared at the water, expecting the English to appear out of the mist. And they did, low, fast, and merciless. The Battle of Gravelines had begun before the Spanish even realized they were under attack. The English came in tight lines, striking fast, retreating faster. Cannon fire rolled across the channel like thunder. Spanish gunners tried to respond, but their decks were chaos. Ropes tangled, crews exhausted, officers shouting conflicting orders. On one ship, a cannon burst from overheating, killing everyone on the lower deck. The splinters tore through men like shrapnel. Blood mixed with seawater until it was impossible to tell which waves were red. The Armada's great crescent formation, once a symbol of divine order, now looked like a broken jaw. English gunnery changed everything. Instead of broadside salvos fired all at once, their gunners fired in rotation, one cannon after another, a rhythm that never stopped. Continuous fire kept the Spanish pinned, unable to reload, unable to close in. The English never boarded. They simply chewed the Armada apart from a distance. Spanish soldiers, trained for hand-to-hand combat, stood helpless at the rails, muskets useless, waiting to die. Their priests shouted blessings over the roar of cannon fire, raising crucifixes that shattered when splinters hit. The Spanish flagship took hit after hit. A mast collapsed, crushing men beneath it. The sails caught fire, then burned out in a black hiss. The Duke stood on deck, covered in soot and sweat, praying as he vomited from seasickness. His officers begged him to retreat. He refused, convinced that turning back would be defiance against God. But even divine pride bends to physics. The wind shifted, the current dragged them toward the shallows, and the English pressed closer. The Spanish fired back, but their shot fell short, splashing harmlessly in the grey sea. When the San Felipe's side was split open, its decks turned into a slaughterhouse. The wounded slipped on blood-slick planks, screaming for surgeons who were already dead. Men tried to stuff rags into cannon holes to stop the leaks, but water poured in faster. One eyewitness wrote that the deck ran with blood until it poured through the scuppers like rain from a roof. The sea itself seemed to bleed. On another ship, a man's head was taken off clean by chain shot, his body staggering 3 steps before collapsing. Even as death filled the decks, the Duke refused to surrender. He raised the royal banner high, signaling the fleet to rally, but no one came. Every ship was fighting its own private war. Communication had collapsed. The English, nearly out of ammunition themselves, kept pressing the illusion of strength. Some fired chain, others nails and stones, anything metal they could find. The Spanish, unaware their enemy was nearly empty, turned and fled, their discipline shattered. God had abandoned the fleet, or perhaps the fleet had abandoned God. As night fell, the English held back. They had won the day, but their powder was nearly gone. The wind turned again, pushing the Spanish toward the dangerous shoals of the North Sea. Medina Sidonia gathered his captains. The decision was simple and suicidal. They would sail north, around Scotland, and return to Spain the long way. The charts were vague. The ships were crippled. Supplies were almost gone. No one had ever taken such a route in winter seas. But there was no other choice. To stay was to die. The first weeks were torment. Rain fell like whips, the wind screaming louder than prayer. The ships groaned under the strain, leaking at every seam. Men went days without food or dry sleep. Water barrels were nearly empty. What remained was green and alive with worms. Sailors began catching rain in their helmets and drinking it, weeping with gratitude. Then the storms came. Black walls of water higher than the masts. Waves that twisted hulls until nails burst from the wood. Ships disappeared without a trace, swallowed whole in seconds. Disease spread faster than faith. Typhus bloomed in the filth below decks. Men's bodies were so covered in lice that they shone under lantern light. The fever turned them delirious. They clawed their skin until they bled, muttering prayers to saints who never answered. Scurvy made their gums rot. Teeth fell out into their food. The few surgeons still alive could do nothing but drain pus and pray. Rats became meals, then shoes, then belts. Some men chewed wood soaked in oil. Others whispered of darker meals, rumours no one dared confirm aloud. Off the coast of Scotland, storms split the fleet again. Ships drifted hundreds of miles apart. Some made for Norway, others toward the deadly Irish coast. The Duke's flagship, limping and half sinking, lost sight of its escorts. Men wept openly, sure the sea was haunted. One Spanish priest wrote in his diary, "The ocean was full of voices, and they called our names." Whether it was wind or madness, no one knew. What they did know was that they were lost, and that God, once their ally, had turned his face away. By the time they reached the northern waters, the Armada was no longer a fleet. The Irish coast appeared like salvation. Green hills through mist, cliffs shining under the brief sun. But the sailors who saw them were already ghosts. Their ships had no anchors, no masts, and no hope. The storms drove them toward the jagged rocks like toys in a bathtub. The wind howled through the rigging like laughter. One ship, the Lavia, struck first, its hull splitting open on the reefs. Men poured out like ants, clinging to wreckage, screaming for a god who no longer listened. The sea answered with silence and salt. The survivors who made it ashore crawled onto the sand, too weak to stand, their armor dragging them down. They collapsed where they landed, kissing the ground, crying for Spain. But Ireland was not a refuge. English patrols scoured the coast with orders. No prisoners. The survivors were rounded up, stripped, and executed in fields still wet with rain. In one day, 600 men were killed near Sligo. Their skulls were smashed with hammers when swords grew dull. The Irish peasants watched, silent, waiting, for their chance to scavenge what the English left behind. When the soldiers moved on, the villagers came. They dragged the bodies into heaps, searching for gold teeth, cutting off fingers to take rings swollen into flesh. Silk shirts became burial shrouds. Velvet cloaks turned into blankets. One Irish woman was seen wearing a Spanish officer's cape to her wedding. The gold coins they found were useless, melted into crude jewelry or traded for potatoes. The proud banners of Castile, once kissed by priests, became rags in fishermen's huts. The empire that ruled half the world now clothed the poor of Ireland. Captain Francisco de Cuellar, one of the few survivors, crawled through this nightmare. He hid beneath piles of corpses, pretending to be dead, while crabs crawled across his face. When night came, he stole clothes from the dead and fled inland. For weeks, he wandered through bogs and forests, hunted by English soldiers. He saw villages burned, women hanged for sheltering Spaniards, and dogs gnawing at human bones. His account, written later, reads like scripture, rewritten by despair. "The sea gave us to the land," he wrote, "but the land wanted us no more than the sea." The storm did not end with the Irish coast. It followed the survivors inland, as if mocking them for believing they could escape. Those who reached villages found sickness waiting. Typhus, brought from the ships, spread like wildfire. The peasants who looted corpses soon lay beside them, skin blistered, lips black. The smell of death hung over fields where no one dared harvest. Priests buried bodies until their arms gave out. When they could dig no more, they burned the dead in pyres that turned the horizon red. Even the smoke stank of rot and salt. Of the 130 ships that left Lisbon, fewer than half would ever see Spain again. Those that did were unrecognizable, sails shredded, hulls scarred, crews skeletal. When the San Marcos limped into Santander, the harbour master vomited from the stench. The hold was filled with liquefied corpses, their flesh melted by the heat of decomposition. The survivors staggered onto the dock like living ghosts. They fell to their knees, not in prayer, but from weakness. Children who came to see the heroes of God's fleet ran away screaming at the sight. The Duke of Medina Sidonia survived, though barely. He was carried off his ship on a stretcher, half conscious, his eyes hollow. He would never command again. In Madrid, he wrote letters begging forgiveness from the king, calling himself unworthy of God's mercy. Philip never replied. The Duke spent his remaining years in silence, unable to eat meat, because the smell reminded him of the dead. When he finally died, no soldier attended his funeral. Spain had no songs left for him, only silence and the whisper of waves outside the Escorial. In Spain's harbours, the people waited for loved ones who would never return. Wives stood at the docks for weeks, praying to saints who stayed mute. Mothers brought candles to churches until the wax ran out. No trumpet announced the fleet's return, only rumours drifted through taverns. Some said the English had killed them all. When the first broken ships of the Armada crawled back into Spanish ports, there were no crowds waiting. No music, No banners, no priest offering blessings, only silence, thick and unbearable. The few survivors staggered off the decks like ghosts in rags. Their hair was matted with salt, their skin blistered and grey. Some had forgotten how to speak. Others still mumbled prayers through cracked lips. The stench of the dead clung to them like smoke. One witness wrote that they came back not as men, but as shadows of the sea. In Santander, the harbour master fainted after boarding one of the returning galleons. The lower decks were filled with black water, half-liquid bodies floating inside. The heat had cooked them into a thick, rancid soup. Sailors who survived refused to enter the holds, saying that the ship itself was cursed. They burned incense on the docks and washed the decks with wine, hoping to drive out the smell. Nothing helped. The city built pyres to burn the corpses. For days, the smoke rose over the bay like a black flag of mourning. In the royal palace of El Escorial, Philip II waited for reports that never brought comfort. He had imagined a triumphal entry. Queen Elizabeth in chains, England returned to Rome, and a new age of divine order. Instead, his courtiers brought lists of ships missing, sons drowned, gold lost. Each message was a confession of failure. Philip stopped eating. He prayed for hours before a single candle, his face pale as the marble walls around him. Servants said he spoke only to his rosary. To them, he was less a king now and more a penitent monk haunted by ghosts. When he finally emerged, his beard had turned white. "I sent them to fight men," he whispered, "not the winds and waves of God." His confession echoed across Europe. Spain's glory, once built on gold and faith, now rested on sand. The empire's debts multiplied overnight. Merchants refused new loans. The silver fleets from the Americas could not fill the treasury fast enough to cover the loss. Half the noble houses of Spain were in mourning, sons and fathers gone, heirs drowned in the cold Atlantic. The greatest empire on earth had been humbled by the sea, but Spain's pride could not admit defeat. The king's chroniclers were ordered to write of divine testing, not disaster. Official paintings showed calm seas and brave faces, not shattered masts and burning decks. The Armada was recast as a trial sent by God, a test of endurance rather than judgment. In truth, it was neither. It was the beginning of decay. The empire would linger another century, yes, but the confidence was gone. Behind the gilded altars and silver chalices, Spain had seen the truth. Faith without reason leads only to ruin. In England, the victory became legend. Queen Elizabeth rode through cheering crowds beneath banners that read, "God blew, and they were scattered." Poets compared her to Deborah and Judith, women of the Bible who saved their nations through divine courage. Churches rang bells for weeks. Captured Spanish flags were hung in St. Paul's Cathedral like trophies. Preachers declared the storm a miracle, proof that heaven itself favoured Protestant England. Francis Drake became a living myth. The reality that England had been out of powder and one good tide away from defeat was buried beneath hymns and celebration. Even so, the victory changed everything. For the first time, England looked outward with hunger, not fear. The ocean that had once separated it from the world now looked like an open road. The defeat of the Armada taught English sailors that speed and innovation mattered more than grandeur. Within a decade, their ships were crossing the Atlantic, raiding Spanish colonies, mapping coasts, and dreaming of empire. The Protestant wind that destroyed Spain became the breath that filled England's sails. The tide of history had turned, quietly but permanently. Across Europe, the shock was profound. The Dutch rebels, long trapped under Spanish rule, saw the Armada's wreckage as divine proof that Spain could bleed. France, exhausted by its own wars, recognized the weakening of a rival. Even in Portugal, annexed by Spain, whispers of rebellion began. The myth of Spanish invincibility was broken, and in its place grew a new age of skepticism. Monarchs began to question divine right. Generals began to trust charts over prayers. The sea, once an altar for crusades, became the domain of science and strategy. Yet for Spain, grief lingered like a wound that would not heal. The Duke of Medina Sidonia retired in disgrace, his health shattered. He refused visitors, spending his last years writing letters begging forgiveness from the king. In one, he confessed that he could still smell the dead when it rained. He died quietly, without ceremony, remembered not as a coward, but as a tragic symbol of obedience over reason. The empire that had sent him to war did not even grant him a state funeral. Spain, weary and ashamed, simply looked away. Centuries later, Divers would find the remains of that catastrophe buried in sand and coral, cannons fused to bones, rosaries tangled in ribs, coins still gleaming beside skeletons. They uncovered letters written by sailors who never reached England, ink still legible, words trembling with hope. "When we return," one wrote, "we will dine in London as lords." His bones were found near Donegal, beside others whose rings had to be cut from swollen fingers. The sea had preserved everything: the arrogance, the faith, the futility. History had no need to lie. The ocean remembered it all. The Spanish called it La Armada Invencible, the Invincible Fleet. But when the survivors staggered home, their eyes hollow. When news of the Armada's destruction reached the Vatican, the silence inside the papal chambers was heavy enough to make candles flicker. Pope Sixtus V had promised Philip 1,000,000 ducats, indulgences, and the blessing of heaven itself. Now his envoys quietly removed those documents from his desk. Rome did not announce a miracle. It announced nothing at all. The banners that had once been prepared to celebrate England's conversion were folded away, stored in a vault that would never open again. For the Church, silence was the only prayer that could soften humiliation. In Madrid, silence turned to denial. Royal courtiers whispered of storms, not failure. Philip's ministers prepared reports describing a glorious retreat, a phrase that fooled no one. Across Spain's harbours, widows crowded the docks, searching the horizon for ships that would never return. Priests read last rites for men who had died hundreds of miles away. The cities smelled of wax and incense, mourning disguised as devotion. Painters were ordered to depict not wrecks, but vessels of faith returning home. The people obeyed the story, but they didn't believe it. The waves had stolen their sons and their certainty. Meanwhile, in London, victory became theatre. Elizabeth walked through Whitehall in white and gold, her hair loose, her armour gleaming. Before a sea of cheering subjects, she declared that God had delivered his judgment upon the proud. Behind her, the banners of captured Spanish ships flapped in the breeze like trophies. Poets compared her to Deborah and Judith. Sermons proclaimed the wind as divine artillery. The English didn't just defeat Spain, they rewrote the script of heaven itself. From that day, Protestant England wasn't merely a nation, it was God's new chosen people, heirs to a destiny Spain had squandered. Yet behind the hymns and banners, England was broke. The cost of victory had nearly emptied the treasury. The fleet that returned home was battered and starving. Sailors went unpaid for months, many dying of disease in the same ports that had once cheered them. The Queen herself complained about the price of gunpowder spent on the celebrations, but the truth didn't matter anymore. Myths are cheaper than armies, and Elizabeth's ministers understood that. They crafted the legend of the Protestant wind, and with it, England's rise began, built on storytelling as much as strategy. In Spain, however, the legend curdled into guilt. Monasteries filled with widows, their sons lost to a sea that refused confession. The sermons grew darker. Priests spoke not of glory, but of punishment. God has tested us, they said, and found us wanting. The crown forbade public mourning. To weep was to question divine will. But in private, even nobles whispered what no one dared print, that Spain had been betrayed by its own pride. The same arrogance that once built cathedrals and colonies had sent men into storms believing prayer could replace preparation. Faith had become fatal. The empire's enemies sensed weakness. In the Netherlands, rebel leaders celebrated the Armada's fall as a divine sign. Dutch fleets struck Spanish convoys with new boldness, cutting supply lines and stealing treasure meant for Philip's wars. In France, ambitious nobles began dreaming of independence from Spanish influence. Even the Ottomans, once fearful of Spain's navy, expanded across the Mediterranean again. The shockwaves of 1588 were not just military, they were psychological. Europe's greatest power had bled in public, and the world had smelled it. From Lisbon to Lima, the myth of Spanish invincibility began to rot. At court, Philip's councillors begged him to rebuild the fleet. "We must show strength," they said. But the king only nodded, lost in thought. His treasury was empty. His ships were scattered. His people, devout but exhausted, could not bear another crusade. When he finally agreed to new construction, it was a shadow of the former grandeur. Fewer ships, fewer priests, fewer illusions. He ordered new prayers for the dead and forbade any mention of invincibility. In his private chapel, he spent hours on his knees, the floor beneath him worn smooth by repentance. The mightiest monarch in Christendom was now a man haunted by waves. England, emboldened, looked outward. The same captains who had fought the Armada, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, began sailing under private charters to harass Spain's colonies. What began as piracy became policy. Gold from Spanish wrecks funded English expeditions to Africa and the Americas. Within a generation, those raids evolved into empire. The sea that had destroyed Spain would now build England. The lesson of 1588 was clear. Courage in weather mattered less than cunning. Empires were no longer ordained by God. They were engineered by men who studied wind, tide, and mathematics. In the decades that followed, the English navy transformed. Shipbuilders abandoned bulky galleons for sleeker, faster designs. Cannons were standardized. Gun decks were lowered for stability. The English learned to fight the sea, not just sail it. Every innovation. The defeat of the Armada didn't just end a battle. It rewrote the balance of the world. When the storm broke Spain, it also cleared the horizon for new empires to rise. In London's taverns, sailors told tales of divine winds and flaming ships. In the Netherlands, rebels lit bonfires and sang hymns of deliverance. Across Europe, kings and merchants began to whisper the same thing. Spain could bleed. The myth of invincibility, built over a century of conquest, had shattered overnight. And in the fragments, England saw its reflection. Small, defiant, and suddenly powerful. Francis Drake, now a legend, returned to England as the face of a new age. His ships carried plundered gold, captured banners, and something more valuable: confidence. The English no longer viewed the sea as a border, but as a highway. For the first time, their maps were drawn not in fear of storms, but in hunger for trade. The very same waters that had swallowed Spain would soon become England's lifeline. From the ashes of the Armada rose a new kind of empire, one driven not by religion, but by commerce. In Seville, the merchants who once counted silver from the New World now counted losses. The fleets that once crossed the Atlantic no longer returned full. English and Dutch privateers raided their treasure ships, striking like wolves in fog. Ports that once hummed with song fell silent. The mince furnaces burned cold. For the first time, Spain's colonies began to question their mother's strength. Rumors drifted from the Caribbean to Peru that Spain's king had lost God's favor. In places where faith had once been absolute, doubt began to spread like a fever. Philip II's ministers did everything to contain it. They censored reports, punished sailors who spoke of defeat, and banned the printing of casualty lists. But truth moves faster than decree. Letters smuggled from Ireland described bodies washing ashore by the hundreds. Survivors spoke of starvation, madness, and cannibalism. Even priests confessed their faith had faltered. The empire that once claimed to rule both ocean and heaven had been reduced to excuses. The word invincible became a bitter joke whispered in taverns and cathedrals alike. Spain's pride had been its armor. Now it was its wound. Meanwhile, England transformed defeat into theatre. The story told in London was not one of luck, but of destiny. Pamphlets proclaimed that heaven itself had raised the storm. Artists painted angels blowing winds from the north, scattering Spanish ships like leaves. The Queen's face appeared on medallions inscribed with the words "Flavit Deus et dissipati sunt." God blew, and they were scattered. It didn't matter that English gunpowder was nearly spent, or that half their sailors had died of dysentery. What mattered was the story. History is written not by the strongest, but by those who tell it best. As England celebrated, Europe listened. Protestant princes toasted the Queen's victory as proof of divine favour. Catholic rulers began to hesitate before allying with Spain. Even France, long caught between fear and rivalry, began to shift its balance. The old world, ruled by Catholic empires and papal decrees, was cracking. The new one, powered by trade and ambition, was forming in the gaps. The English sea dogs became symbols of this new world, bold, irreverent, and unbound by old faiths. Where Spain had prayed, England calculated. Where Spain sought absolution, England sought opportunity. The following years turned myth into movement. English ships began exploring beyond the known seas, west to Virginia, south to Africa, east toward the Indies. Investors replaced crusaders, profits replaced indulgences, and behind every voyage stood the same quiet belief born in 1588, that the sea now belonged to them. The winds that had scattered Spain's fleet became the breath of England's ambition. Every new harbour discovered, every fort built, every trade route claimed was another verse in a song that had begun with the storm. For Spain, that storm never ended. Each year brought new disasters, bankruptcies, revolts, mutinies, and colonial unrest. The The gold that once sustained its armies now fed its debts. The same faith that once unified it now divided its people. Priests quarreled with generals, nobles blamed God, and peasants prayed for a peace that never came. The empire still stretched across the world on maps, but in truth, it was shrinking in spirit. Its ships grew slower, its coffers thinner, and its prayers longer. The age of Spanish conquest had ended, not with a bang, but with the sound of waves retreating. In England, the victory aged into legend. Children were taught that the storm had been God's hand. Poets called it the turning of the tide, and for the next 3 centuries, that illusion of divine favour would fuel an empire that would stretch farther than Rome's, its sails reaching every horizon. The defeat of the Armada had not merely changed who ruled the seas, it had changed how men imagined power itself. Faith gave way to reason, banners gave way to trade routes, and destiny, once painted in gold and incense, was now written in ink and salt water. 4 centuries later, the bones of Spain's sailors still rest beneath the Irish sand. Divers find rosaries tangled with chains, coins fused with coral, and crucifixes buried beside cannonballs. Each artifact tells the same story, that arrogance is the oldest enemy of empires, and the sea is its executioner. Nations rise, believing themselves chosen by heaven, until the tide reminds them that heaven has no favourites. The Armada's wreckage is not just Spain's grave, it is a mirror, showing every empire what waits when pride sails faster than wisdom. And so the waves keep whispering, even now, not of conquest or glory, but of warning. The ocean remembers everything, centuries pass, but the ghost of the Armada never truly sinks. Every storm off the Irish coast still churns up fragments, a buckle, a musket ball, a rosary tangled in seaweed. Fishermen haul up timbers blackened by fire, iron nails twisted by waves, bones polished smooth as ivory. The Atlantic has become a slow storyteller, whispering the same tale over and over: pride, faith, and salt water. Historians call it a naval disaster. Poets call it divine irony. But the sea, which buried both, calls it balance. The moment arrogance met weather and lost. Spain tried to forget. Official records were sealed. Artists painted victory where there had been none. Priests rewrote sermons to praise divine testing, not punishment. Yet every family who'd lost a son remembered. In coastal villages, widows still hung lanterns in windows facing west, hoping light might guide ghosts home. They believed the souls of the drowned still walked beneath the waves, their armour heavy, their eyes hollow, forever marching toward a shore that never appeared. The Invincible Armada had become not a fleet of ships, but a fleet of restless spirits. In England, memory became myth. The story of 1588 turned from history into heritage, a national creation myth carved in oak and painted in gold. Plays and poems turned Elizabeth into a saint, and the English sailors into instruments of heaven. The defeat of the Armada became the moment England discovered itself. Small but fierce, chosen but humble, guided not by popes or priests, but by wind and courage. That story would echo for centuries, through Trafalgar, through the Empire, through every ship that set sail under a flag bearing St. George's Cross. But myths have power. They shape how nations see themselves, and how they lie to themselves. England learned to mistake fortune for destiny. Spain learned to confuse faith with invincibility. Both forgot that history is written by storms. The men who drowned in 1588 never cared about creeds or crowns in their final moments. They clung to floating beams, prayed to any god who would listen, and watched the same merciless sky. Their empires, their kings, their popes, all seemed small against the black vastness of the sea. Archaeologists diving off the Irish coast found more than artifacts. They found human stories trapped in silence, a sword still clutched in a skeletal hand, a locket with a woman's face, her features blurred by salt, a silver crucifix fused to bone. One diver described the site as a cathedral of the drowned. Cannons for columns, ribs for pews, skulls for worshippers. 400 years later, the mud still preserves the Armada's prayer, a frozen moment when faith met futility. The ocean had become their tomb and their confessor. In time, Spain's defeat reshaped the world more than any victory could have. The age of crusades ended. The age of empires began. No longer would men sail for salvation. They sailed for trade, for profit, for power. The sea had taught them that God's will could not steer a rudder. The men who once carried rosaries now carried compasses. The wind that had scattered the Armada filled the sails of science, reason, and ambition. The storm that humbled Spain built the modern world. Every nation that rose after 1588, from England to the Americas, owed something to that wreck. Still, the story remains more than politics or maps. It's about belief, and what happens when belief forgets its limits. The Spaniards thought their cause was holy. The English believed their victory divine. Yet both were only human, tossed between faith and fear. Empires always see themselves as chosen until the waves remind them otherwise. The sea doesn't take sides. It simply waits. Every generation that sails too proudly, that mistakes destiny for design, sails the same route as Philip's fleet, toward a storm it believes it can control. Every few years, divers recover another relic, a musket barrel, a jeweled buckle, a scrap of embroidered silk. They rise from the seabed like memories, glinting briefly in the sun before being claimed by museums. Yet for every artifact found, thousands more remain below, untouched, unseen, perfectly preserved in the cold darkness. The Atlantic keeps its secrets, but not forever. With each new discovery, the story sharpens. The ghosts of the Armada still speak, not in words, but in echoes of thunder and surf, reminding us that no empire, no matter how blessed, escapes the tide. So, when the next storm lashes the Irish coast, and lightning flashes across the black horizon, some still swear they see it, the faint silhouette of ships in perfect crescent formation, their masts lit by ghostly fire, their banners snapping in a wind that no longer blows. The Invincible Armada still sails, somewhere between memory and myth, chasing a victory it will never reach. The waves close behind them, patient, eternal, and indifferent. And maybe that's the final lesson. That history is not written in ink or marble, but in water. It changes shape with every telling. And in every century, another empire forgets and sails again. If you found this story haunting, the faith, the folly, and the fall, then stay with us, because history is full of ghosts just like this one, lost between glory and ruin. Subscribe, and we'll bring them back to life, one storm at a time.